In our work, we build theory through exploring the interspaces of our intercultural interactions, drawing on our own culturally situated narratives and the conversations we have about shared experiences, to which we have brought our differing lenses. When we started working together around 7 years ago, we had both been enculturated into the Western Academy and had learned in different ways to rely on canonical works in our field. We were very uncertain of the legitimacy of our knowledges, and it is only over time that we have felt more comfortable and more confident about working in the ways that we describe here. It was about 2 years ago that we came across Bhattacharya's chapter, Theorizing from the Streets. Her work strongly resonated with what we had been doing and gave us a language to articulate the process that has been central to our de-colonization of knowledge production, a process in which street theories and folk knowledges are given a legitimate place alongside other knowledges that are outside the academic gaze, and then these put into conversation with theories and knowledges that are privileged in academia. In a sense, we are making visible what it means for our different subject positions and all that these entail to coexist, not in a combative or competitive way, but in a state of dialogue that we approach with humility as opposed to the arrogance that is symptomatic of coloniality and neoliberalism. Through our dialogic interactions, we are not seeking to persuade each other to come to our way of thinking, but rather to open the boundaries to the possibility of coming to know differently, and thus expanding our subject positions. It's for this reason that we write de-colonization with a slash between the D and the colonization, as Bhattacharya states, to denote the lack of a pure utopian decolonizing space by being in an already relationship with colonizing discourses and materiality. Therefore, decolonizing denotes a movement within, in between, and outside colonizing discourses and decolonizing desires. So there is no utopian decolonized space. We are never going to get there because we already have been colonized, and everything we do is from that colonial lens, even as we try to decolonize. So we've got to make sure that we understand that there's no colonial without decolonial, and vice versa. It's always entangled. Accordingly, in this coming session, we are going to start with two narratives that demonstrate our processes in theorizing invitation and hospitality from the streets.
Okay, so we're beginning with a shared experience that we had in 2016 when Fatima was in England as a visiting academic at the University of Exeter. And in this narrative, we have changed the names of the people involved. My sister Anne had her 60th birthday party during Fatima's stay, and we were both invited to the party. At the time of the party, Anne's eldest daughter, Rachel, had been living with me for 3 years and had been dating her boyfriend, Simon, for about 2 years. While driving to the party, Fatima asked me whether Simon would be there because she hadn't met him. I explained how Rachel had invited Simon, but that for the last couple of months, he had not given a firm answer one way or the other. Both Rachel and her boyfriend were at that time in their late 30s and wary of long-term commitments. My reading of the situation was that Rachel was ready to take the relationship one step further by including Simon in the family event. Fatima questioned why Simon wouldn't commit to accepting the invitation to an event that was obviously important to Rachel, and she started to reflect on what might be happening in this situation. Fatima imagined the space of the party as being Rachel's family's space, and Simon as being an outsider. Simon might perceive Rachel's invitation as inviting him to enter a space in which he would be a stranger. In offering the invitation, Rachel had indicated a level of commitment to the relationship that might not have been there before. However, rather than giving Rachel a straightforward response of yes or no, Simon exercised power over her by neither accepting nor rejecting the invitation outright. So this shared experience provided a way for us to think about what it means to invite someone into a space that they do not feel ownership of. For example, from a student's perspective, a classroom might be seen as the teacher's. So how might a teacher establish a positive social relationship in what is perceived to be her or his space? How might she invite students into that space? Now, there's nothing new in the idea of teachers establishing positive relationships with their students, but what counts as positive relationships may be based on Euro-Western ideas. For example, as Shauneen talked about earlier, what it means to be inviting, caring, respectful, and to use student-centered teaching methods. All of these can be achieved within a colonial form of relating. So this scenario provided us with an experience that we discussed, drawing on the differences in our respective cultural ways of viewing, being, and doing, and how these might help us develop decolonial ways of being inviting, which would involve a holistic understanding of what it means to be inviting that includes a spiritual dimension, and for us, also connected to our different cultural understandings of hospitality, which we understand as maintaining a sense of connection and belonging over time.
You're going to love this one. In the following narrative, by the way, we're reading this because we love to chat and talk and embellish, and it just takes so much time. So this is much easier and much more exact. In the following narrative, I'm going to relate one example which Fran and I experienced together, and how we started to think about how we could use this to theorize and put to practice in education, in particular in relation to educational relationships in classroom spaces. So Fran and I had been working together for several months when I invited her to the University of Regina to come and work with me on this project. It was wintertime. There was snow and ice on the ground and roads, and the temperature in Regina fluctuated from -15 to -35 degrees centigrade. Fran was staying with me for the whole semester from January to April. And Fran has a very different dietary requirement to mine. And therefore, before she came to Regina, she sent me an email with a list of foods that she could not eat. In her email, she stated the following: I'm vegetarian. I'm allergic to mushrooms. I'm highly intolerant to yeast, so no bread, and anything with culture, so no yogurt, or that has gone through a fermentation process to make it, things like cheese, tofu, soya. I'm highly intolerant to refined sugar and have difficulties with citrus fruit. I'm fine with eggs and milk and cream. I'm fine with all pulses, etc., as long as they have not been put with yeast to make something. Right. So this is the email I get. So let me tell you, my ancestors originate from Western India, that is from Gujarat and Kutch, and we were part of the Lohana caste. In the 15th century, we converted to the Shia Ismaili Nizari sect of Islam. In order to facilitate the conversion, several of the Hindu customs, rituals, and traditions were kept and practiced alongside Islamic ways. One of those customs that we continue to practice even today emanated from Indian Buddhist philosophy, and in Sanskrit, the phrase is Atitha Devo Bhava. This is the practice where we revere a guest or guests with the same respect as we would God. Islam similarly embodies a similar philosophy. Islam holds hospitality as a virtue that lies at the very basis of the Islamic ethical system, a concept rooted in the pre-Islamic Bedouin virtues of welcome and generosity in the harsh desert environment. And the concept can be found in the Arabic root dayafa. The Prophet is reported to have said, "There is no good in the one who is not hospitable." So Each day, whilst Fran was here, we went to the university together, where I shared my office with her, and at the end of the day, we would go back to my place and I would cook supper for the two of us. I was fine with that, with the list, but in general, when Fran was staying with me, I cooked two meals, one that would suit Fran and one that would suit me. 3 or 4 times a week, I would eat exactly what Fran ate. Fran did offer to cook for herself, but as part of my spiritual inheritance and my cultural frames of reference and customs and rituals, I felt it was my duty to cook her meals, help her with her laundry, buy all the food that we needed, and pay for all the meals when we went out to restaurants, tickets for movies, and so on. I thought of Fran as a very honored guest and friend. So we come legitimately to our case in point. I was simply trying to act in the manner that I had been brought up in. A month went by and all was well. In the second month, I was getting tired of the responsibility. I was getting tired of having to give up the TV shows that I liked to watch so that Fran could choose what she wanted to watch. I was getting tired of cooking, thinking of vegetarian dishes to cook, cleaning and trying to teach, work on our research and entertaining Fran. As I mentioned in the beginning of the narrative, it was bitterly cold outside and we really couldn't go anywhere except to the shops, university, maybe see a film on the weekend and go out for meals. And the meals were mostly at Indian restaurants in town. The tension started to rise. Fran was feeling cooped up in my apartment, not being able to go for long walks as she's accustomed to in England. And as I had not involved her much in the daily living tasks, she felt helpless. And she was used to having her privacy, which was difficult to do in my apartment. She did want to pay for the groceries, films, and so on, but I wouldn't hear of it because it would have gone against the very fiber of my being. In our readings around experience, we came across Derrida and his theories of conditional and unconditional hospitality, and the concept of aporia. Hospitality is a philosophical concept that was developed by Jacques Derrida in the context of individual relations in France and the reception of immigrants and refugees by the state. The core ideas of which have most commonly been applied to educational relationships in culturally plural settings. Aporia is the paradox, the tensions in the ways in which power is enacted. So let's go back to my story. So although I was the host and Fran was the guest, I, with the power to give and Fran the receiver, the balance of power had shifted over time, and we realized that Fran was also wielding power. I became the oppressed and Fran the oppressor. Although there are other examples that we can provide, this experience was the catalyst that started us thinking about how hospitality is enacted in educational relationships, and in particular, the power relations between the teacher and the students and student agency, how these are enacted in classrooms, and how the concepts of invitation and hospitality can act as mediators towards changing existing educational relationships. Fran?
Thank you, Fatima. So to begin to connect what we've referred to as street theorizing on invitation and hospitality to the discourses of coloniality, we're going to return to the framework that we used in the previous session. And here we identify some of the lies of coloniality as we perceive them in education policies and practices. In doing so, we're not saying that when using the terminology, narratives, and theoretical frames, individuals are necessarily deliberately lying. Our purpose is to demonstrate how, at a system level, things are often presented as either neutral or as a good that is hard to argue with. Yet, by using a critical de/colonial lens, it is possible to reveal the alternative truths that are hidden under these discourses. As an example, we're going to focus on diversity and inclusion. These are terms widely used that are portrayed as positive and as an assumed good. The Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Action Plan for the recruitment of Canadian research chairs states that institutions with 5 or more designated chairs should, and I quote, guide their efforts in sustaining the participation of and/or addressing the underrepresentation based on institutions' equity gaps of individuals from the 4 designated groups. These being women, persons with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and members of visible minorities. This, along with the 7 equity, diversity, and inclusion principles published by Universities Canada in 2017, has led to increases in action plans at institutional levels. In an analysis of university EDI strategies, Tamtik and Gwenter note that, and again I'm quoting, for some institutions, this means increasing recruitment across diverse student, staff, and faculty groups. For others, it means focusing their efforts on providing institutional supports through targeted programs, support services, and funding. And they also note that some scholars argue that HEIs need to move beyond a passive discourse of valuing diversity and performative commitments to inclusion and equity. And for us, these reflect some of the most common discourses that frame equity, diversity, and inclusion. The first being representation. We just need more BIPOC staff and students, and a patronizing deficit theorizing that positions those who have been systematically excluded as in need of support to be included. In addition, the neoliberal accountability discourse directs much of the financial and human resources available to the tasks of monitoring and reporting, also suggesting that if the targets are met, the job is done. To expand on the example of diversity as representation, Christine, we can hear, oh, thanks. Sorry. To expand on the example of diversity as representation, we argue that narrowly defining diversity in this way fails to address the whiteness of the university system and arguably contributes to the graduation gaps that exist. For example, research conducted by the Environics Institute reported that although greater numbers of people were attending the university, graduation gaps continued to get wider. In terms of the concepts we're exploring in this seminar, this could be understood as universities inviting a wider range of staff and students into their educational spaces, but then not thinking through whether those spaces are hospitable to the differences that BIPOC staff and students bring with them. So the consequences. Going back to a funnel diagram that we used in, I think, one of the pre-recorded seminars, this shows how coloniality creates oppressive relations from the level of government that then trickle down to how the nation is imagined as a community of citizens, then to how education and curriculum are conceived, and the sorts of student-teacher relations that may be possible. On the right-hand side, we give examples of these oppressive relations and the ways in which they are alienating and dehumanizing. For example, as we've already argued, there's a lack of spiritual dimension to relations. There's a rise in mental health issues. There's the commodification of education in higher education, research production, metrics, and so on. There's the hegemony of the Eurocentric curriculum, assessment, and instruction that does not serve all students. There are challenges to academic freedom and freedom of expression. And we stress that the list is common to all universities at a system level, but that within these there are differences in how specific universities are seeking to mitigate some of the harmful effects. And for example, at the University of Regina, there's an ongoing focus on indigenization as evident in the 2020 to 25 strategic plan, all our relations, and in the appointment of Pauline Street as the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer for Research. Fatima?
So yes, thank you. So we're looking at how power is situated within the concepts of invitation and hospitality. So power is usually understood as being used oppressively. At the same time, from government policy to teacher actions in the classroom, portraying education and educational relations as neutral is a successful mechanism for evading considerations of power and thus maintaining the status quo. Yet power is present in the forms shown here and influence whose knowledges and ways of being, doing, and viewing the world are seen to be legitimate, whose ways are included and whose excluded. However, although power exists in all relations, it is not always used oppressively. We argue the explicit recognition of these forms of power are essential if the ideas of invitation, hospitality, and spirituality are to have the power to disrupt oppressive discourses and to develop new, more equitable relations between teachers and students. This means recognizing that the power that students also hold. For example, the power to refuse the invitation, as we demonstrated in the example of Fran's sister's 60th birthday party. Next slide, Fran. In Martin Buber's seminal work, I and Thou, he theorizes about different forms of human relations. His basic position was that we need to resist the temptation to reduce human relations to the simple either-or ways of relating to others. He proposed that humans are beings that can enter into dialogic relations, not just with human others, but with other animate beings, such as animals or a tree, as well as with the spiritual, existential, or divine thou. Buber's theory is made of three interrelated parts, and the next three slides that we show you gives an overview of each of the parts. Right?
The central thesis that Buber developed is the twofold attitude of I-it and I-thou. In this way, Buber is stating that I can only be understood as part of a relation. The I-it relation prevails between subjects and objects of thought and action. I-it relations have the following characteristics. It is a relationship of subject to object, a form of indirect knowing that comes from viewing the world as something met or related to through experience, control, and rationality. It is a monological relationship. It has a seeking to know and use in order to control orientation. Relations therefore have an agenda. It is a relation of separation, a distancing between self and other, emphasizing individuality. This requires only parts of oneself in the relationship, and I-it relations can therefore only be partial or fragmented. And we liken this really to colonial forms of relation. The I-thou relation, on the other hand, is a relation that occurs in encounters between subjects that exceeds the range of the Cartesian subject-object relation. The I-thou relation is felt as a mutual, present relationship and has the following characteristics. Subject-subject relationships that are a form of direct relating that comes from viewing the world as being met through encounter with humility. It is dialogic, present in the sense of being in the moment, mutual and open. It is a relation that cannot be sought, but is rather a relation of togetherness, a being with that does not use and that emphasizes connectivity. It involves the whole being, an authentic being fully with another. It's therefore an ethical relation that some refer to as love.
Okay, we describe this relation as an attitude of doing to. So Buber argues that life at a societal level has become dominated by I-it, subject to object relations. We can see this in the way education has become treated as if it is part of the market economy. Teachers and schools are judged by the results. The curriculum serves as a predetermined purpose of creating a workforce and a citizenry that conforms to the imaginary of British identity that we discussed in our first presentation. The league tables are seen as ways of identifying which schools offer best value for money to help parents make informed choices about where to send their children. In order for this sort of system to work, everything is treated as if it is an object that can be measured against standardized objective criteria administered through national and international tests. However, as we have demonstrated in previous seminars, these so-called objective criteria are based on mainstream white colonial ways of being and doing and viewing in the world. It is not hard to see that I-it relations are relations of separation in which both teachers and students may find it hard to connect to the curriculum and each other. But for those students whose identities are different from the mainstream, and as we have said, the majority of teachers come from the mainstream dominant culture, the sense of disconnectedness and alienation is often far greater. Fran?
So life at a spiritual level, we describe as being an attitude of being with. For Buber, in considering life at a spiritual level, the concept of encounter, as we've just mentioned, is important. Encounter is an eventual situation in which relation occurs, and we can only grow and develop once we have learned to live in relation with others and to recognize the possibilities of the space between us. The fundamental means of I-thou spiritual relation is dialogue. Buber talks of genuine dialogue, no matter whether spoken or silent, where each of the participants really has in mind the other or others in their present and particular being, and turns to them with the intention of establishing a living mutual relation between him or herself and them. This is a relation of togetherness, a being with that does not set out to use or set conditions on the relationship, but emphasizes connectivity. And to enter into such a relationship requires being in a state of readiness. It means that the self has to put aside one's own desires to approach with humility and, through dialogic interaction, to get to know each other fully as whole beings. Buber describes this as authentic, spiritual, and ethical. If we translate this form of relationship into a classroom setting, this would mean that the teacher would not approach the relationship based on assumptions or stereotypes about who the students might be, but would be inviting and hospitable to the students' authentic selves, based on a holistic understanding of who they are that comes through that reciprocal relationship. A holistic understanding is not bounded by particular sets of purposes and objectives. It's an unconditional togetherness, using the whole being, and is reliant on the development of mutual trust. So Buber argues that there needs to be more of a balance between I-thou and I-it relations. He is not saying that I-thou should replace I-it relations, but that society, and therefore education, needs to create the space for both. Without the inclusion of I-thou, ethical spiritual relations, what happens at classroom level becomes an othering and impoverished form of education. Buber envisaged this as a process of creating a dialogical community, a third way between individualism and collectivism. Community is seen as the realm of the between individuals that moves between I-it and I-thou relations and back again. The quality of life in that community, and here we're thinking about community in educational terms, will depend on the extent to which I-thou relations exist.
So our practices of being inviting and hospitable Here, I give some examples of the practices we have used with pre-service teachers in a course that I was taught that was called e-reading 4 to 5, I think culturally responsive literacy education, and how we used invitational and hospitable types of approaches. So one of the first elements in de/colonizing educational relationships is expanding awareness of self and identity, and encouraging self-reflection on and understanding of one's complicities in coloniality. It is a process of becoming conscious of what was previously unconscious, as shown on the previous slide. Forgiveness is a crucial quality to foster in this process. The purpose is not to enter into a blame game about complicity in historic colonialism. Feelings of denial, for example, why should I be accountable for what my ancestors did? And guilt, for example, I feel awful about what my ancestors did, but I don't act in those ways, can act as a barrier to any meaningful change. Our purpose is therefore to distinguish between historic colonialism and contemporary coloniality, and to reveal how unconsciously each of us is complicit in different ways in the modern project of coloniality. Awareness and recognition of complicity requires a forgiving orientation on the path of both educator and student in order to be able to move forward in a proactive manner. And I'm going to say in a good way. The teacher education program in the Faculty of Education at the University of Regina is focused on anti-oppressive and anti-racist education. And among other grad and undergrad courses that I taught an elective course called e-reading 4 to 5, which I mentioned before, which is taught to pre-service teachers in their 4th year. And this is in their final semester before graduation. So after 4 years in their Bachelor of Education program, right after they complete their semester of internship, they may choose to take this course. I had realized several years ago that educational relationships include, but is not limited to, teacher-pupil relationships. In order to help the realization of the best potentialities in the student's life, I needed to learn to see the student in what Buber states as in his potentiality and his actuality. And so to do so through awareness of, in quotation marks, him as a whole being and affirm him in this wholeness. For Buber, ethical education entailed educators engaging with others, with their whole being, through direct relations and dialogue. So we had already started working on these before we came to know about Martin Buber. We had to figure out a way to model, enact what Fisher in 2013 stated: authentic, loving, and humble human interactions that are transforming and affirming, in order that the pre-service teacher candidates could model the same when they started their own teaching career. So in this slide, we show you how we moved from an institutional colonial way of doing education to a de/colonial way, always keeping into account the content requirements that we had to keep in mind, that the Saskatchewan Ministry of Education and the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation's their content requirement as well. Could you go to the next slide, please? So here are some of the, I'm going to just read some of these out to you. Susan shifted for, so these are examples of pre-service teachers' reflections on being invitational and hospitable. So Susan shifted from previously thinking of classrooms as neutral to now being aware of how she was othering or difference, and that to not be othering required a different approach to teaching. Rather than thinking she had to invite the student into her space, Susan had come to realize that by, in quotation, by entering the student's space, you give up some of your dominance and control. I found this is in fact a form of hospitality by shifting the circumstances and placing yourself in a position that alters the dynamics. Nadine, and that's the second quote, was convinced that a relational approach can be used to show these students that they are valued, respected, and appreciated, and that we can validate their sense of who they are. We argue that these forms of care are colonial in nature. They continue to use liberal savior discourses that are both othering and patronizing. Adrian was a very interesting case. Adrian had been resistant to the core concepts of the course, of the total course, right from the outset. He was unable to access students' funds of knowledge at all. Our own observations were that he let the student take control of the situation. His view was that the student was, in quotation marks, was inadvertently teaching himself. He got to maintain the expert role. End of quotation. Adrian stated that the course didn't challenge me much, and that working in intensive ways with marginalized students might be amazing, but it was a larger drain on resources than students that go with it, which we take to mean toe the line. Fran?
Yeah. So we're going to move to beyond abyssal thinking, Fatima. Slide 17.
Thank you. So modern Western thinking is an abyssal thinking, and it consists of a system of visible and invisible distinctions, the invisible ones being the foundations of the visible ones. The invisible distinctions are established through radical lines that divide social reality into two realms: the realm of this side of the line and the realm of the other side of the line. The division is such that the other side of the line vanishes as reality becomes non-existent and is indeed produced as non-existent. That is, not existing in any relevant or comprehensible way of being. What most fundamentally characterizes abyssal thinking is thus the impossibility of the co-presence of the two sides of the line. Moving beyond abyssal thinking involves the following conditions, and we've got it right there. Of these, Sousa Santos identifies intercultural translation as the most characteristic post-abyssal feature. Buber argued that the most blatant manifestation of I, it, and ego orientation in modern societies is the nation state, which he did not view as a true community because it is built on one built on a fragmented distancing of self and other. An I-thou orientation would be a world that is a single body, understood as interconnected, interdependent, and interrelational. To create such a community requires a living center, someone who is a fully realized person, who lives the twofold attitude to relations, a human on earth whose spirit flows through. The living center acts as a guide or teacher, creating and supporting forms of communal life whose members share the goal of developing individually and communally. Such a community would mediate between the meta-psychic and the material social character of reality. And thus careful attention would be needed on the in-between spaces of I, it, I, thou, spiritual, social, and material relations. So reading Buber, it seems that such processes do not appear spontaneously. Rather, it comes about through, in quotations, first, they're taking their stand in living mutual relation with the living center, and second, they're being in living mutual relation with one another. The second has its source in the first, but it is not given when the first alone is given. The image here that was also on our title slide is a way I found of expressing the complex interconnected relationality between teachers and students in educational spaces. It came out of a discussion Fran and I were having over a year ago, and before we came across Buber's idea of a living center and community. It's another example of our theorizing from our own experiences, through our own conversations, and then going to the literature to see if others have thought about similar things. Rather than this process being one of validation, we now see it as a process of expanding theory by putting ours and Buber's ideas in conversation with other or with each other. Fran?
So what we're saying is that rather than classrooms being dominated by mainstream culture and potentially being uninviting and inhospitable to all other ways of being and doing, classrooms can be reimagined as spaces of critical intercultural interaction and interrelation. These are interactions between the intersecting dimensions of all aspects of identity: ethnicity, gender, religion, class, ability, sexuality, language, age, and so on, and the different cultural ways of being and knowing that come with them. An invitational and hospitable classroom would therefore be replete with encounters with difference, and understanding how to work with and in these spaces of interculturality is, we think, a key part of working towards de/colonising classroom relationships. And within each form of relation, there are the micro, meso, and macro levels of understanding, all of which are interrelated, interconnected, and interdependent. And on this slide, what we've done is try to represent in a visual form what this means for us. So on the left-hand side, the deep maroon red represents a ground of coloniality on which education is located, or in which education is located. And within that colonial ground, the I-it dominates. And you can see hiding behind the I-it is the I-thou, because it's not as if the I-thou doesn't exist, but because of the nature of coloniality, it's put onto the margins. And so the space of intercultural interaction between those ways of being is relatively small. There's not much space for it. On the right-hand side, we've got a decolonial ground, which is a paler maroon color. And here now you can see that the circles that represent the I-thou and the I-it have a broken boundary to represent that they are porous and that there is movement within and between them. And here we've put the I-thou type of relation, the spiritual relation, as the most important, with the subject-object I-it form of relation being developed as a result of that, or as part of the I-thou. And the space of critical intercultural interaction there is far greater. And over time, we anticipate that that spiritual form of relation would grow. And we've italicized the inter in intercultural here to signal that our focus is on the understanding the space between subjects, cultures, onto epistemologies. It's a space of both intra and intersubjective relations within a critical intercultural interactions. So the interactions are both within and between the meso, micro, and macro scales, and they are plural spaces of both and rather than either or. They're spaces of tensions and aporia, and also of emerging and becoming. And in becoming, and becoming as in becoming fully human, beg your pardon. So for the relations to be authentic, the living center, guide, or teacher would need to be inviting and hospitable in the ways that we have demonstrated. And at the top of the diagram, you can see there is a continuum from unconscious through conscious to another consciousness. And what that represents for us is, in order to begin to create decolonial spaces for educational relationships, The teacher needs to understand herself as well as fragmented, either because of a lack of understanding of connections and relations to broader socio-cultural, geopolitical, and historical contexts that formed her, and or because of her lived experiences of the oppressive forces of coloniality. And we have conceptualized this as a move from being unconscious of those colonial relations to becoming conscious and ultimately moving into a new decolonial consciousness.